Well, welcome along to our Good Friday service for 2020, where we recall the death of Jesus on the cross. My name's McLaughlin. I'm one of the ministers here at Elwood Anglican. And can I add my welcome to James's? It is such a privilege to be invited into your living room or home today on this Good Friday. And today we want to look at the question that's on the lips of many people throughout this whole coronavirus pandemic, and that is, where is God in COVID-19? And this is a very good question, but it's not a new question. You see, it's a question Western society has been asking for the past 100 years. Where is God in all this suffering? And there's a very simple reason why people are asking this question. You see, pretty much every single religion on the planet says the same thing. Pretty much every religion says, if we do good, God will bless us. But if we do evil, God will curse us. The problem is, the last 100 years has seen innocent people suffering on a scale that is unmatched in human history. Right? It's estimated that between Hitler, Stalin and Mao, just three people, around 200 million people were murdered, give or take 10 to 20 million. Now that is a staggering amount of people, innocent people, suffering, is it not? And because of this shocking amount of injustice and evil and suffering, people have been asking serious questions about the existence of God. Where is God in the Holocaust? Where is God in Stalin's Russia? And where is God in COVID-19? And no religion on the planet has a satisfying answer to this question, except, that is, biblical Christianity. See, what I want to show today is that the God of the Bible is radically different to the God of every single other world religion. And that is because the God of the Bible does not say, if you're good, God will bless you, and if you're evil, God will curse you. Truth be told, that's actually a very self-centered God anyway. It's a God that's there just to make me happy, isn't it? The God of the Bible says, every human does evil, and therefore every human deserves judgment, deserves suffering. But the God of the Bible came to earth some 2,000 years ago to take that suffering for us. You see, the beauty of passages like the one that was just read for us is they don't tell us just what happened on that very first Good Friday. They tell us the reasons why it happened. And if we can understand the reasons behind the suffering of Christ, it actually helps us to see where God is in times of suffering. And look, I've got 3 points to help us see this today, to help us understand where is God in COVID-19. So our first point looks at the facts of Good Friday, and that is that Jesus came to earth for the expressed purpose of suffering on the cross. And so I've titled our first point, The Nature of Jesus' Suffering. Yet the author Matthew is not just interested in the facts. He wants to show us why Jesus would actually allow himself to go through such deep, deep suffering. And so I've titled my second point, The Reason for Jesus' Suffering. The passage then ends on a very helpful note by looking at two very different responses to Jesus. And so the title of my third point is The Response to Jesus' Suffering. But which response we choose will actually make the difference between whether we actually are able to answer the question of where is God in COVID-19? Or maybe we can't answer it. So let's dive in and see where is God in our suffering by looking at the nature of Jesus' suffering, the reason for Jesus' suffering, and the response to Jesus' suffering. And our passage picks up the narrative of that very first Good Friday after Jesus has already been arrested, tried in a kangaroo court, beaten, mocked, spat upon, flogged, paraded through the streets, stripped naked, nailed down to a cross, and hung up between two criminals. All right, it has already been a day of immense suffering for Jesus. And then we read this in verse 46. This is Matthew 27, verse 46. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, the first thing to note is that this crying out is not very becoming of a religious leader. You see, so far, Jesus has been quite calm through this whole ordeal, but in verse 46, he seems to lose it. Now, the most common argument against Christianity is that the Bible was just made up by Jesus' followers. But here's the thing, if you were making up a religion, you wouldn't include a scream like this, right? You'd portray your founder as a strong, courageous, and dependable leader, not as someone who snaps under the pressure. And so the first thing to note about this crying out is it shows us this really happened. The second thing to note is what Jesus is crying out. Now, like I mentioned, Jesus has undergone immense physical and emotional suffering already. But notice, he's not crying out, my head, my head. Right? Jesus isn't focused on his physical suffering from the bruises from the beating or the scratches from the crown of thorns. Nor is he crying out, my heart, at the psychological trauma he is enduring. All right? He cries out, my God, my God. This is spiritual suffering Jesus is experiencing. Okay, so the darkness we're told about in verse 45 represents what's actually happening to Jesus here, and that is Jesus is suffering God's judgment on the cross. Jesus is suffering hell on the cross. You see, fire and brimstone is only one of the Bible's descriptions for hell. The more common description is the place of spiritual darkness where God pours out his wrath on sinners. And that's what Jesus is experiencing here. The reason he's beginning to unravel is because he is being plunged into spiritual darkness that is God's wrath. Now you may be thinking, well, look, he's only on the cross for 6 hours. It's not that bad. But we need to realise that heaven and hell are actually outside of time. They're eternal. What this means is there's no such thing as just 6 hours in heaven or 6 hours in hell. Right? Jesus is not thinking, if I can just hang in there a few more hours. He was experiencing the sense of being infinitely lost, of suffering infinite wrath of the Father. But we need to go one step further, I'm afraid, to look at who he's being forsaken by. Right? His Father. Now you see, if you or I were forsaken or rejected by an enemy, we could cope with that, couldn't we? I mean, no one likes being rejected, but we could cope with it if it's an enemy. But what if it's a friend? That would hurt us, wouldn't it? We'd be sitting there thinking, well, what is wrong with me that this friend of mine has rejected me? But what if we're rejected by a spouse? Psychologists tell us that there is little more traumatic in life than being rejected by a spouse. Some of you have actually had to experience this. It takes years to work through that kind of pain. It's similar for children who feel rejected by their parents. It is enormous trauma. But friends, here's the thing. No spouse and no child has ever experienced the closeness that Jesus did with the Father for all eternity. You see, the relationship Jesus had with the Father was infinitely closer than the best marriage or the best parents on earth. And so when the Father casts Jesus out, Jesus' experience would have been infinitely greater than all the hells of every person who ever deserved to go there combined. So the first thing this passage shows us is that Jesus did not come to earth just to share our suffering. He came to earth to experience infinite suffering. However, the author Matthew is not just interested in telling us the nature of Jesus' suffering. He wants to tell us the reason for Jesus' suffering as well. And we see this in verse 50. Where is it? When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the temple of the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about these holy people being raised to life. It's very intriguing. But these mini resurrections, if I can call them that, are a picture of the final resurrection that will happen for those who die in Christ. But we're going to be looking into this future hope on Easter Sunday, so you'll have to come back then. The thing I want to focus on is this curtain in the temple being torn in two. What is this about? Well, look, scholars point out to us that when you went to the temple, it's no longer around, but when you did go to the temple back in those days, one of the first things you noticed was barriers. You see, there were barriers in place stopping certain people from getting too close to God who resided in the central part called the Holy of Holies. Right? There's all these barriers. So the first barrier was for Gentiles. All right? Non-Jews were only allowed in the outer court of the temple. The next barrier was for women. Okay, the court of women was as far in as women were allowed. The Jewish men were allowed into the inner court, but only the priests were allowed into the temple itself, and only the high priest was allowed into the Holy of Holies, and even then, only once a year. And so the whole setup of the temple just screamed no access, no access. And the reason for this goes all the way back to Genesis 3, chapter 3, where Adam and Eve took the forbidden fruit. Now, we need to remember that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was not poisonous. Right? There was not some sort of magic elixir in that fruit. It was a metaphor for whether humanity would obey God or rebel against God's one command, do not eat of that fruit. And Adam and Eve failed that test, as has every single human born since then. And two things happened that day, right? The first is God cursed this world as a punishment for humanity's sin that came with Adam and Eve. And so when things go horribly wrong in this world, like COVID-19, they are a reminder that we are living under the judgment of God. Right? God is not punishing us for a specific sin in COVID-19, well, not that we know of anyway. It is simply an outworking of living in a world that is under the judgment of God. The second thing that happened that day is a barrier opened up between God and humanity. And the reason for that barrier is that sinful humans can no longer be in the presence, or humans, now that we're sinful, cannot be in the presence of a holy God without being burned up. It's just like paper cannot come into contact with fire without being burned up. Right? Our God is a consuming fire that burns up anything impure, like sinful humans. And that's why the temple had to have barriers to protect sinful humans from being consumed. But something amazing happened on that very first Good Friday. The curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the people was torn in two, from top to bottom. And what this tells us is that the moment Jesus was cast out, rejected, right, forsaken by his Father, was the moment that we were given access to the Father. That barrier that was designed to protect us from being burned up by his holy presence was removed. Now, how is this possible? Well, we see it in Jesus' final words. You see, Matthew doesn't recount for us Jesus' final words. We're just told he cried out and then gave up his spirit. But in John's Gospel, we are told what Jesus cried out. And what Jesus cried out was, "It is finished. It is finished." And what he means is, the suffering that he has endured has done its job. And that job was to take God's punishment for us. So even though every human has done evil, and therefore every human deserves God's judgment, God's suffering, Jesus came to take that punishment for us. He traded places with us, right? He was cast out so that we could be let in. He was rejected so that we could be accepted. He was forsaken so that we can never be forsaken again. So this leaves us with just one question, which is, how do we respond to Jesus' suffering? Because how we respond to Jesus' suffering will be the difference between being able to take COVID-19 in our stride versus descending further into fear and anger over COVID-19 or other forms of suffering. Right? Where is God? And our passage actually gives us the two possible responses to Jesus. The first one comes directly after Jesus' first cry of Eli, Eli. So have a look at verse 47. When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. Now, we're not told exactly who those standing there were, but we suspect they were religious people because their thoughts turned very quickly to the greatest prophet in the Old Testament, who is Elijah. But why did their thoughts turn to Elijah? Because they misunderstood Jesus' cry. Okay, as Matthew tells us, Eli, Eli is Aramaic for my God, my God. But these people seem to have heard it as a shorthand for Elijah, right? Eli, Eli, he's calling Elijah. And this is the first possible response to Jesus, to completely misunderstand him. And the way people misunderstand Jesus is by thinking that he is just like the gods of all the other religions. Right? If I do good, God will bless me. If I do evil, God will curse me. But notice what he's saying. What that's saying. It's saying it's not finished. Jesus wasn't finished, right? Because I still need to prove my worth before God will bless me. See, when Jesus said it is finished, what he meant was you don't have to earn God's blessing anymore. It has been given to you. You have been given full access to the Father and the Father's blessing. Right? All we have to do is rest in that gift. And this is what the Gentiles did. Have a look at verse 54. It's the great verse of this passage. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Right? It's the outsiders, the Gentiles, who actually respond correctly to Jesus, who actually understand Jesus and who he is. And it's often the same today. See, there are people who have been going to church for years who still don't understand Jesus, who still see him like every other religion. Right? They think it's their pedigree of going to the right church or their good works or their religious deeds that get us right with God and that actually earn his blessing. It's often the complete outsider who understands Jesus properly, who understands salvation is given. Right? Access is given, not earned. And friends, if we understand this, if we understand the cross, then we won't get as worried or angry about times of suffering. Right? We don't sit there crying out, "What the hell, God? You're supposed to be blessing me for all those good deeds that I've done." Why? Because the Christian knows suffering is not a punishment. We know God is not cursing me for some bad thing I've done. And the reason we know that is because we know Jesus took that punishment for us. It is finished. See, when suffering comes to a Christian, we ask a completely different question. The question Christians ask is, how are you using this time of hardship to grow me, Lord? When times of suffering come, we look to Romans 8:28, which tells us God uses things like COVID-19 to bring about the good of those who love him. So friends, to understand where is God in COVID-19, we have to understand Jesus. Right? If we're still trying to earn God's favour, then we haven't understood that it is finished. See, if you're one of those people that's always working hard, that can never say no to people, that's always feeling guilty, that can never rest, that is always trying to prove their worth, what are you trying to do? You're trying to finish for Jesus. And when suffering comes your way, you will struggle. You will continue to cry out, where is God in COVID-19? And there is no answer. But to those who understand Jesus, we don't even ask that question. We've got the answer. We ask a completely different question. Now, those who do understand Jesus, we still obey him. We just do it for a completely different reason. We don't obey to finish for Jesus. We obey because Jesus has finished for us. We have been given access to God's blessing now and into eternity. So when Christians are asked, where is God in COVID-19? We answer, well, first, COVID-19 is a reminder that sinful humanity is living under God's judgment. But second, we respond by saying, well, Jesus' suffering finished that judgment for me. So God must be using COVID-19 simply to make me stronger. Romans 8:28.